The dirt was still cold under my nails when I lifted that mud-soaked lockbox into the moonlight, my breath catching as if the ground itself had warned me to stop. The trees around the cabin were silent, holding their breath with me, while the weight of that metal box pressed into my shaking palms like it carried every secret I'd refused to see. If you've ever felt the air change around you right before your life does, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I promise. Stories like this are closer to home than most people want to admit. In that moment, with the smell of wet earth clinging to me and my heart pounding harder than it had in months, I already sensed the truth waiting inside. I just didn't know how deep the betrayal would run. Let me show you how it all began. I remember standing in the cold dirt behind my cabin at 2:30 a.m., holding a mud-covered lockbox that felt heavier in my hands than its size should have allowed. I was shaking, not from the Michigan air, but from the dread crawling up my spine. I had dug it up because I had seen my son and daughter-in-law burying something back here in the middle of the night. At first, I convinced myself it had to be nothing, just my mind acting out of grief. But the moment the shovel struck metal, I felt something inside me slip. Mark had been gone for 8 months. I was still waking up some mornings expecting him to be there, still reaching for him when the house creaked. Losing him left me softer, less guarded, and I never imagined that vulnerability would become dangerous. As I scraped the last of the dirt off the lid, every memory of the past months rushed through me, my son's strange distance, the hushed tones, the way Melissa avoided my eyes. When I finally opened the box, the truth inside hit me so hard it felt like the ground shifted. I remember staring at those papers, feeling the bottom of my life drop out. Whatever sense of safety I'd been clinging to evaporated right there in the dark. I didn't understand everything yet, but I knew one thing. Whatever had been buried wasn't meant for me to find, and to make sense of it, I had to go back to those early months after losing Mark, when the first cracks quietly began to form. Mark and I built our life on steadiness. He was the kind of man who kept every receipt, labeled every folder, and double-checked anything that mattered. When his health began to decline, I noticed how he started leaving little reminders for me, quiet gestures that felt like his way of preparing me for a world where he might not always be beside me. I didn't want to see it then. I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch, that we still had time. But looking back now, I can feel the weight of those moments in a way I couldn't at the time. When he passed, the grief settled over me like a heavy fog. Simple tasks felt impossible. I kept replaying our last weeks, wondering if I missed something important he was trying to tell me. In that haze, I was vulnerable in ways I didn't recognize. That was when Aaron and Melissa stepped in. They showed up constantly, always with this air of concern that, at first, felt comforting. I remember thinking how grateful I was not to face everything alone. But slowly, small things began to gnaw at me. They became unusually involved in Mark's paperwork, offering to handle things before I even had the strength to open a drawer. They reacted strangely whenever I mentioned wanting time to myself. I felt an undercurrent of impatience whenever I hesitated to sign something they placed in front of me. At first, I brushed off the discomfort as part of my grief, telling myself I was reading too much into normal help, but the red flags kept adding up. I found documents moved from where I left them. Conversations shifted the moment I entered the room, and every time I felt a twinge of unease, they were ready with reassurances that made me question my own instincts. That slow erosion of confidence worked on me until I didn't trust what I was feeling anymore. Still, something inside me kept pulling at the threads. A quiet instinct telling me that Mark's meticulous nature wouldn't align with the chaos I was seeing. That instinct is what ultimately pushed me toward the truth, toward that lockbox buried behind my cabin and the answers I never expected to find. When I carried that lockbox inside and set it on the cabin floor, the mud smeared across my palms felt almost symbolic, like the truth itself had been buried and left to rot. My hands trembled as I pried it open. I told myself I was ready. But the moment the lid lifted, I realized nothing could have prepared me for what waited inside. Right on top was Mark's real will. I knew his handwriting instantly, the steady, careful strokes I had watched for decades. Seeing it again after 8 months hit me with a wave of grief so sharp it felt physical. Then, as I read through the pages, that grief twisted into something else. Confusion, shock, a cold kind of clarity. This will was nothing like the one Aaron had shown me after the funeral. In Mark's true version, everything was laid out exactly the way he used to describe: thoughtful, fair, and rooted in the life we built together. The one Aaron presented, it had been altered, entire sections rearranged, entire decisions rewritten. Beneath the will were bank statements and transfer records I didn't recognize, funds moved without my knowledge, accounts opened under my name that I had never seen before, and the signatures, some tried to mimic Mark's, others pretended to be mine. The longer I stared, the harder it became to breathe. Every page felt like a blow, each one proving this wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was intentional. Then I found Sophie's letter. It was folded neatly, her handwriting small and shaky. As I read her words, I felt my heart drop. She had seen things. She had heard arguments. She tried to warn me in the only way she knew how, tucked away where she hoped it would be safe. Realizing she had carried that fear alone broke something inside me. By the time I closed the lockbox, the room felt different, colder, narrower, almost unfamiliar. Everything I thought I knew about the past year shifted in that moment. And to understand how deep this went, I had to look back, through every memory I once brushed aside, and see them again for what they really were. When I closed that lockbox, it felt as if every memory from the months after Mark's death snapped into a new shape. Moments I once brushed off as grief fog now stood out with painful clarity. I kept replaying them in my mind, seeing details I hadn't been able to hold on to before. I remembered how Aaron and Melissa hovered over me in those early weeks, their voices soft, their expressions sympathetic. Yet there was always an edge beneath it. At the time, I thought they were worried I couldn't handle the paperwork or the house on my own. Grief made me doubt everything: my energy, my judgment, even my memory. So when they insisted I let them take care of things, I told myself they were helping. Now, looking back, I can feel the condescension in those moments, the way they nudged me toward feeling incapable. There were subtle pressures about selling the house, then the cabin. I remember Melissa gently suggesting it might be too much for me to maintain, that simplifying my life would give me space to heal. I didn't hear the urgency underneath it then, but now it feels unmistakable, like they were trying to move me out of the way. The hardest memory to revisit involves Sophie. They kept bringing up her future, how expensive college was becoming, how stressful finances were for them. I remember feeling guilty, like I should step in somehow, It never occurred to me that those conversations were laying groundwork, shaping my emotions so I wouldn't question anything they put in front of me. With the forged documents still fresh in my mind, every one of those memories tastes different, bitter, calculated. The buried box didn't just reveal paperwork, it revealed intent. And as much as it hurt to face, I knew the next step was clear. If anyone could help me understand the full truth, it was Sophie. I barely slept after opening that lockbox. By 7:15 a.m., I found myself sitting at the small kitchen table in the cabin, staring at the landline as if it might tell me what to do. My hands were still unsteady when I finally dialed Sophie. I didn't know what I expected. But the moment I heard the strain in her voice, a part of me braced in a way I hadn't the night before. She tried to sound normal at first, too normal, and that alone told me she'd been holding something in for a long time. I could hear the hesitation, the way her breath caught, the way she kept circling around something she was terrified to say. When she finally began to unravel, it wasn't loud. It was the soft, stifled kind of fear that only a child who has felt unsafe in her own home could carry. Through her trembling explanations, I started piecing together a truth far darker than anything I had imagined. She had overheard her parents months ago, whispering about me as though I were an obstacle. Words like "speed things up" had lodged themselves in her memory, scaring her so deeply she didn't know who she could trust. She told me, in her own fragile way, that she had tried to hint at it before, that Mark had gently asked her questions, sensing something wasn't right. Hearing that broke me open. My sweet girl had been carrying fear alone, and Mark, even in his weakened state, had been trying to protect us both. As Sophie spoke, the heartbreak I felt slowly hardened into something steadier, protective, clear. Whatever fog grief had left in me burned away in that moment. I knew I couldn't let this spiral any further, not for myself and not for her. When I hung up, the path forward felt painfully obvious. It was time to stop reacting and start preparing. And to do that, I needed help, real help, from people who knew how to expose the truth. The morning after talking to Sophie, I felt a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. Fear was still there, but it wasn't steering me anymore. I gathered the lockbox, packed the documents in a folder, and drove straight to Richard Avery's office. He'd been our attorney for years, someone Mark trusted with anything that mattered. Walking through his door with that evidence in my hands made my stomach twist, but it also felt like the first real step toward protecting myself. Richard listened quietly as I laid everything out. Mark's real will, the forged signatures, the hidden accounts, the transfers I never authorized. I watched his expression shift from concentration to something heavier, something that confirmed the truth I had been afraid to fully name. When he finally leaned back, the weight of his assessment hit me harder than I expected. His calm, measured tone carried the unmistakable message that I had been the target of elder exploitation and fraud. Hearing those words, even indirectly, made my chest tighten. It was one thing to suspect it alone in my cabin. It was another to have a professional validate every fear I had tried to dismiss. He guided me through the next steps. Stay quiet, act normal, avoid any confrontation, and let him coordinate with investigators. I remember absorbing his instructions like someone taking shelter in a storm, clinging to structure because everything else felt unsteady. The idea of pretending everything was fine around Aaron and Melissa made my skin crawl. But I knew he was right. If I pushed too soon, They would hide evidence or disappear entirely. Driving home, I practiced keeping my face neutral, my voice steady, as if preparing for a performance I never wanted to give. But beneath the tension, there was resolve. The trap was set. The truth was in motion now, and all I had to do was hold steady until it surfaced. The days leading up to everything breaking open were some of the longest of my life. Holding myself together felt like walking across thin ice, pretending nothing had changed while everything inside me churned. Every time Aaron or Melissa stopped by, I forced my breath to stay steady. I kept my tone gentle, my gestures familiar, even as my heart raced with the knowledge of what Richard and the investigators were preparing behind the scenes. It was a strange kind of performance, one that demanded I hide both fear and fury. But even masking my emotions, I began noticing things I had missed before. Quick glances they exchanged, the sudden stiffness in their posture whenever paperwork was mentioned, the way Melissa's smile tightened when I said I had been organizing old documents, little tells that confirmed what the evidence already proved. They were waiting, too, waiting for an opportunity, or maybe waiting for me to finally give in. And beneath all their polite warmth, I sensed a growing uneasiness, as if they could feel something shifting. The morning it all unraveled, the tension in the house felt different, heavier. I remember setting a cup of coffee on the counter when I heard the knock at the door, firm, official, unmistakable. I watched Aaron's face drain of color. Melissa's hands froze mid-motion. In that split second, their expressions told me everything. They knew exactly why investigators had arrived. What followed played out like a blurred series of impressions, documents being presented, their frantic attempts to explain themselves, the hollow disbelief in their voices as each forged signature, each unauthorized transfer was laid out in front of them. I stood there absorbing it all, feeling heartbreak and relief collide in my chest. It hurt, more deeply than I expected, to witness my own family scramble to deny what they had done. But there was also a quiet release, a sense that I wasn't fighting shadows anymore. When the investigators finally stepped in and took control, the house felt strangely still. Their voices steadied the room, grounding everything in undeniable fact. And as Aaron and Melissa's world began to collapse around them, I realized this was only the surface. The confrontation had exposed the lies, but something deeper, something more complicated, was still waiting for me just beyond that moment. In the quiet that followed the confrontation, I felt strangely hollow. The house, once tense with unspoken fear, now felt emptied out, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after months of pressure. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought exposing the forged documents and finally being believed would bring a clean sense of resolution. But life rarely offers clean endings. As I moved through the house, gathering my thoughts, I stumbled into a truth I hadn't been prepared to face. It happened when I opened Mark's old desk drawer, the one I hadn't touched since he passed. I don't know why I went to it. Maybe the adrenaline needed somewhere to go, or maybe some part of me sensed there was still more to uncover. Inside, beneath neatly stacked envelopes, I found a folder I had never seen before. My name was written on it in Mark's handwriting, steady but a little weaker than usual. The sight of it tightened something in my chest. Inside were notes he had made during his last months, quiet observations, dates, patterns he had started tracking. At first, I didn't understand. Then it hit me. He had seen it. He had suspected Aaron and Melissa long before I ever did. He had been trying to protect me, even as his own health deteriorated. One page in particular shook me, a brief, painful reflection where he wondered if something in the way he raised Aaron had created this distance, this entitlement. Reading that broke my heart in a way the forged documents never could. The betrayal wasn't just mine. Mark had felt it too, in his final days, and carried that weight alone. There was also a letter, unfinished, addressed to me. He had written that if anything happened to him, he wanted me to look closely at our accounts, to trust my instincts even if others tried to sway me. It wasn't accusatory, it was gentle, protective, full of the quiet love he always showed in small, thoughtful ways. Holding that letter, I felt my grief shift into something deeper, more complicated. The truth wasn't just about fraud. It was about the fractures in our family that Mark had noticed long before I did. As painful as it was, I knew facing this new reality was part of moving forward. And with that understanding, I felt myself step into the next chapter, ready to pursue real resolution and whatever justice was still ahead. The days after everything came to light moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if the world itself was giving me time to steady my breathing. The legal process began unfolding in careful steps, each one documented, reviewed, and handled by people who knew how to navigate situations like mine. Watching it all from the outside was strange. Part of me wanted everything resolved immediately, but another part understood that real justice takes its time. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone in it. Aaron and Melissa faced consequences I never imagined having to see my own family endure. Freezing of accounts, formal charges, and the kind of scrutiny that strips away any remaining illusion. It hurt. Of course it did. No mother wants to watch her child answer for something like this. But pain doesn't make wrong things right, and loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from accountability. Accepting that truth became its own quiet milestone. In the middle of all this, I found myself returning to small routines I had abandoned after Mark passed. I made coffee the way he used to like it, even if it was just for me. I opened windows. I sat on the porch and breathed in the cold Michigan air without feeling afraid of what the day might bring. Reclaiming these little moments felt like piecing myself back together. There were still waves of grief. Grief for Mark, for the family I thought I had, and for the trust that had been broken so deeply. But beneath the sadness was a steady undercurrent of relief. The danger had been named, the truth had been witnessed, and the life I nearly lost was my own again. As the weight lifted, I felt myself shifting into a different kind of clarity, one that invited reflection more than fear. I knew there was one more part of this story I needed to share, not just to close the chapter, but to speak honestly about what it taught me. And as I reached that place, I felt ready to finally turn toward you and offer the lesson this experience carved into my life. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how easily life can shift beneath our feet. What began as quiet grief became a journey through betrayal, truth, and ultimately, a rediscovery of my own strength. I never imagined I would have to defend myself against the people I loved most, or that I would uncover parts of my family I didn't want to see. But I also never imagined I could come out the other side feeling grounded, steady, and whole. This experience taught me that boundaries are not walls. They're invitations for healthier relationships. It reminded me that listening to my instincts is not a sign of distrust. but a form of self-respect. And it showed me that healing often comes from facing hard truths with an open, honest heart. If you're going through something similar, if you've ever questioned your worth, your safety, or your place in your own family, I hope my story reminds you that you're not alone. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's a quiet decision to keep going. Thank you for staying with me through this. If this story meant something to you, please consider liking and subscribing, and share your own thoughts or experiences in the comments. I read every one,